Hello students, welcome to the channel. In this video, we'll solve the third reading passage of the March 2020 USSET. This is a science passage. This passage is adapted from Emily Munoson, Evolution in a Toxic World, How Life Responds to Chemical Threats. UVB radiation can damage DNA. DNA photolyase is an enzyme that can repair DNA damage. Andrew Blaustein, an ecologist at the University of Oregon, has studied frogs for decades, and for the past 10 years, he has turned his attention to the role of UV radiation in population declines. Like many ectotherms, animals formerly known as cold-blooded, some frog species lay their eggs in sunlit ponds or puddles, expressly relying on the sun's energy to speed along egg hatching, larval development, and metamorphosis before their ephemeral pond dries. Much like photosynthesis or vitamin D production, it's a trade-off. In the frog's case, faster development in a higher risk environment. Of course, like most creatures living under the sun, amphibians are well defended against UVB radiation. In addition to behavioral changes like burrowing in mud or laying eggs in logs or under rocks and the production of natural sunscreens, amphibians have redundant systems for DNA repair, including DNA photolyse. Okay, so this introduces the passage, the first paragraph, which talks about the effect of ultraviolet radiation on amphibian populations, and particularly on egg hatching, right? Because amphibians such as frogs lay their eggs in ponds that are exposed to sunlight. This is to kind of speed along the hatching process. But at the same time, because of ultraviolet radiation that can be damaging, it's a trade-off that frogs have to guard against, right? So this talks about the threats that this trade-off brings and some of the natural mechanisms that frogs employ to protect themselves. For example, burrowing in mud or laying eggs under rocks, or even the naturally producing sunscreens and DNA photolyse. Interested in the level of protection afforded by DNA photolyse and the potential impacts of increased UVB exposures on frog populations, Blaustein and co-author Lisa Belden compared the life history habits of several amphibian species with DNA photolyse activity in their eggs. Their study revealed strong positive correlations between UVB-resistant frog species, a species, for example, whose eggs are normally most exposed to sunlight because they are laid in sunny, shallow ponds, and increased photolyse activity in comparison to species whose eggs tend to be protected from direct sunlight. In other words, frog species that lay their eggs in sun-drenched environments are better able to repair DNA damage caused by UVB. Okay, so there was this study that was conducted and that showed a positive correlation between the amount of ultraviolet radiation that the frog species receives and photolyse activity, which is to say that if the frog species lays its eggs in sun-drenched environments, then it is better able to repair DNA damage through photolyse. Not only that, but subsequent field studies confirmed the detrimental effects of naturally occurring levels of UVB to developing eggs of some frog species, while those with the highest concentration of photolyse, the Pacific tree frogs, were most resistant. Beyond killing embryos, write Blaustein and Belden, UVB exposure may also cause sublethal and potential subtle and therefore more difficult to measure effects on larval growth and development. Okay, so it's not just about the death of the embryo, right? It's also about other changes that can hamper the quality of life. And those also seem to happen when there is ultraviolet radiation in the area where the eggs hatch, right? And here again, it is seen that frogs with the highest concentration of photolyse, the Pacific tree frogs, they are the most resistant to that damage. Their findings raise an intriguing question: are less resistant species more susceptible to DNA damage caused by increased UVB, right? So in case you don't have enough photolyze or you don't produce enough photolyze, are you more susceptible to DNA damage caused by ultraviolet radiation? The question was answered in part by researchers working with a single species of frogs inhabiting different altitudes of the French Alps. Frog populations adapted to life at higher altitudes and therefore naturally higher UVB exposures showed less DNA damage than did their lower altitude brethren when exposed to UVB intensities typical of high altitude. Okay, so researchers were able to conduct this natural experiment along different altitudes of the French Alps, and they noticed that frogs that hatched at higher altitudes and so had adapted to life at higher altitudes, they showed less DNA damage when exposed to UVB compared to those frogs that populated the lower altitudes. Identifying the genetic mechanism of this adaptation, rapid evolution, increased protein production, or both, will require further study. Although DNA photolyzed concentrations were not measured, the authors report an interesting twist that suggests increased photolyzed activity in high altitude tadpoles. Interested in other ways frogs might experience DNA damage, they studied the effects of benzopyrene, a well-characterized carcinogen present in cigarette smoke, coal tar, oil, and myriad other combustion products. BAP is both an ancient toxicant and a major industrial pollutant. Activated BAP binds with DNA, causing a kink in the DNA helix, just like UVB. A specialty of DNA photolayers is kinky DNA. It turns out that high altitude frogs had less BAP-induced DNA damage compared with their lowland cousins. Added protection by DNA photolayers? Maybe. Until enzyme concentrations are confirmed, any added protection cannot yet be attributed to increased DNA photolayers. Okay, so this brings another aspect of the study that exposure to higher levels of UV radiation at high altitudes brought about an adaptation in the frogs that caused them to produce more photolyze. But this increased production of photolyze protected them not just from UV radiation, but from other pollutants like BAP. So when you have BAP in the system, it attaches itself, binds itself with DNA, resulting in a kink in the DNA helix. Just as happens with UV radiation. UV radiation also causes a kink in DNA helix, and a kinky DNA is the specialty of photolyze. So there's the possibility that increased photolyze presence also protects the frogs from other pollutants like BAP and not just ultraviolet radiation. But this is something that hasn't yet been confirmed because enzyme concentrations were not measured in this experiment. Okay, we'll come to the figures later. 22, based on the passage, which situation is most similar to that described in lines 10 to 13? Okay, so lines 10 to 13, what do they say? These lines. Much like photosynthesis or vitamin D production, it's a trade-off. In the frog's case, faster development in a higher risk environment. Okay, so it's a trade-off that they're talking about. A male elk that expends considerable energy to grow large antlers. A deer that forages in an area with plentiful resources in close proximity to predators. A bird that experiences rapid bone growth while losing bone strength. A turtle that produces a small clutch of eggs because resources are scarce. Okay, so I think it would be B because the trade-off that we are talking about in the sentence is that the frogs, they want to go for faster hatching. And for that, they are in an environment where there is risk, right? The risk of UV radiation. And that's similar to a deer that forages in an area with plentiful resources, because obviously the deer gets food and so the deer goes and forages there. Yet the risk is that there are predators and the deer could be harmed. So this is kind of the same analogy, the same contrast that the sentence presents. Okay, the elk producing antlers using considerable energy is not an external threat, right? That is something that is metabolically done within the antler's body. So this doesn't represent an external threat in the way the UV radiation or the predators represent in option B, right? So it's not A. Similarly, C is also related to the bird's internal metabolic processes, rapid bone growth causing a decrease in bone strength. So this is again not similar to what the sentence says. And a turtle producing a small clutch of eggs because resources are scarce is just a cause-effect situation, right? It does not indicate an external threat. So B is the best answer. The passage indicates that burrowing in mud may benefit some amphibians by delaying egg hatching and larval development, repairing damage caused by UVB, limiting their exposure to sunlight, reducing their need to produce sunscreen. So it's C, right? Because we see here that the burrowing, yes, in addition to behavioral changes like burrowing in mud or laying eggs and the production of natural sunscreens, amphibians have redundant systems for DNA repair. So they want to kind of limit their exposure to the sun. Like most creatures living under the sun, amphibians are well defended against UVB radiation. So this comes from the fact that their natural behavioral tendency is to kind of limit sunlight exposure. So limiting exposure to sunlight. This is not related to delaying egg hatching or larval development. This is just a behavioral technique to reduce exposure. So it's not A. Damage caused by UVB is the topic of the experiment, the topic of the study in the passage, but that is not the sole reason that the frogs protect themselves from sunlight. So this is not related to damage by UVB alone. And yeah, and again, producing sunscreen is one of the ways in which they protect themselves, but that is again not the reason that they burrow in mud. The primary reason is to just protect themselves from sunlight. Based on the passage, it can most reasonably be inferred from the research conducted in the French Alps that living at higher altitudes affects larval growth and development. High levels of UVB exposure cause lethal effects at all altitudes. DNA photolysis concentrations are naturally higher in the species of frogs that were studied. Tolerance to UVB exposure can vary within a species. So it's D, right? Because you can see that the UVB exposure was tolerated better by those species living at higher altitudes because they had adapted themselves in a way that UVB exposure doesn't affect them so much. While those at the lower altitudes where sunlight was scarce, they did not have the same tolerance for UVB exposure. So it's D. That particular French Alps research is not about larval growth and development. That's about adaptability to UVB exposure. So A is not correct. We are not talking about all altitudes. We are talking about the difference in altitudes with regard to UVB exposure. So B is not correct. And it's not about the species of frogs that was studied, right? It was about the differential tolerance to UVB between or within the same species, right? So C is not correct. Which choice provides the best evidence? 47, 49, 49, 54. Okay, so 47 to 49, 49 to 54. 54, 56, 57, 60. 54, 56, and 57, 60. Okay. The question was answered in part by researchers working with a single species of frogs inhabiting different altitudes of the French Alps. Frog populations adapted to life at higher altitudes and therefore naturally higher UVB exposures showed less DNA damage than did their lower altitude brethren when exposed to UVB intensities typical of high altitude. So it's B, right? Because this shows you that there was a difference in tolerance to UVB exposure based on the altitude at which the frog population lived. Option A just introduces the experiment, so it's not that. Identifying the genetic mechanism of this adaptation will require further study. So this goes to the next step, identifying the genetic mechanism. So it's not this. Although DNA photolayers concentrations were not measured, the authors report an interesting twist that suggests increased photolayers activity in high altitude tadpoles. So again, this looks at the possible causes of why they adapted differently, but we are looking at evidence for the different adaptation. So that's B. As used in line 61, experience most nearly means experience. Okay. Interested in other ways frogs might experience DNA damage. So frogs might undergo or frogs might suffer DNA damage. So let's look for those words. So undergo is an option. So that's my answer. Frogs are not practicing DNA damage. So it's not B. It's not about feeling DNA damage. So it's not D. And you're not withstanding DNA damage, right? To withstand is to resist, right? For example, the army withstood the advances of the enemy, right? But here we know that these frogs experience DNA damage, so it's not C. It can reasonably be inferred from the passage that if further research demonstrated that DNA photolysis protected the high altitude frogs from BAP-induced DNA damage, then Pacific tree frogs should demonstrate a similar ability to cope with BAP pollution in their environment, thrive in high altitude habitats in the French Alps despite the change in climate, exhibit BAP-induced DNA damage only when exposed at high altitudes, produce tadpoles that have clear evidence of kinks in their DNA helices. Okay, so here we are kind of trying to connect two ideas in the passage. One, we are saying here that it is possible that it was DNA photolayers which provided protection against BAP, but that is something that has not yet been established because the enzyme concentrations were not confirmed. And then we are saying that those with the highest concentration of photolayers, the Pacific tree frogs, how would they react to this finding that DNA photolayers does provide protection from BAP-induced DNA damage? So my first instinct is to go with option A, because if DNA photolayers does provide protection from BAP-induced damage, then Pacific tree frogs should demonstrate an ability to cope with that pollution because they have the highest concentrations of DNA photolayers. So I like A. Option B says thrive in high altitude habitats in the French Alps despite the change in climate. I don't think it's about Pacific tree frogs thriving in those habitats, right? That's not the point. The point is how their high concentrations of photolysis can protect them from BAP pollution, right? So I don't like B. Exhibit BAP-induced damage only when exposed at high altitudes? No. The altitudes are related to sunlight, right? BAP-induced DNA damage is not related to altitudes. This is present regardless of the altitude, so it's not C. Produce tadpoles that have clear evidence of kinks in their DNA helices. So I think this is not just about Pacific tree frogs, right? Any frog that has BAP-induced damage will show kinks in their DNA helix because the marker of BAP damage is the kink in the helix, right? So it's not about just the Pacific tree frogs, but about any frog showing the kink in their DNA helix. So I don't like D either, but I'll confirm between A and D after going through the line numbers. So 25 to 31, 43 to 46, 25 to 31, 43 to 46. Okay, so that's here. 43 to 46. Okay. 60, 64, 66, 70. 60 to 64 and 66 to 70. Okay. So Their study revealed strong positive correlations between UVB resistant frog species and increased photolysis activity in comparison to species whose eggs tend to be protected from, no, so this is talking about UV radiation, not BAP damage. Option B is also talking about UVB radiation, so I think I can jump to option C. Interested in other ways frogs might experience DNA damage, they studied the effects of benzopyrene. Okay, so this is just kind of introducing benzopyrene. It doesn't really talk about its effect on frogs. Activated BAP binds with DNA, causing a kink in the DNA helix, just like UVB. A specialty of DNA photolayers is kinky DNA. It turns out that high altitude frogs had less BAP-induced damage compared with their lowland cousins. So option D is categorically making a connection between BAP and photolysis, right? Because I'm saying that activated BAP leads to kinky DNA and the specialty of photolysis is kinky DNA. So I think option A would be the best answer because we are saying that Pacific tree frogs have a high concentration and of photolysis, and so they would demonstrate an ability to cope with BAP. I don't think the idea about producing tadpoles makes sense because we are not really talking about that in option D, about how the next generation would kind of, show a kink in their DNA. So it would be option A for 27 and option D for 28. As used in line 72, confirmed most nearly means confirmed. Until enzyme concentrations are confirmed, right? So until enzyme concentrations are verified, that's a good word for that. Verified. So we have that here. You can't administer enzyme concentrations. You want to kind of say that we wish to make sure that the enzyme concentrations are what we believe them to be. So we each wish to verify them. You're not approving them and you're not strengthening them, right? So the best answer in the context is C. Okay, which statement is best supported by data in figure 1? Okay, so let me take a screenshot of this and put it there. Oh, figure 1, okay. Okay, so figure 1 is photolysis activity, egg laying location and exposure to sunlight in selected amphibian species. Okay, so this is species, this is activity, and only those amphibian species with photolysis activity less than or equal to 0.7 lay their eggs where there is no exposure to sunlight. Okay, less than or equal to 0.7. So I'm looking at, I'm looking at this, and this. So they lay their eggs where there is no exposure to sunlight. No exposure to, yeah, so this seems true, right? Option A makes sense because there is no exposure to sunlight here. All amphibian species with photolysis activity greater than 3.5 lay their eggs in locations with high exposure. Greater than 3.5. So no, but this is variable exposure. This is not high, so this is wrong. Only those amphibian species with photolysis activity of 7.5 or greater lay their eggs with variable exposure. So 7.5 or greater is only Hyla regula, and this is not variable, this is high exposure, so C is wrong. All amphibian species with photolysis activity of 1 or greater lay their eggs in open shallow water. 1 or greater. So we are looking at this, and this. Open or shallow water. So this is open water. This is open water, but not these two, right? This is submerged stem and this is debris. So D is also wrong. So the right answer is option A. Yeah. Okay, so let's choose A for this. Okay, what about Which species lays its eggs in locations with the greatest exposure to sunlight? Okay, greatest exposure. And what are the options? Cadaverina, Aurora, Regilia, and Gracile. Okay. So I'm looking at Cadaverina, Aurora, Regilia, and Gracile. So this is exposed surface, variable exposure, high exposure, and some exposure. So highest is with Regila. So option C, I think Regila was, yeah, C. Which data from figure 2 appear to be inconsistent with the researchers' observations about the frog populations in the French Alps as presented in the passage? Okay, so let me take a screenshot of this. Okay, so this is about the data being inconsistent with the researchers' observations, right? So let's see. Micronucleated erythrocytes as indicator of DNA damage in UVB exposed temporaria frogs by altitude. Okay, so this erythrocyte is indicator of DNA damage. So the higher values indicate higher DNA damage. And this is the altitude above sea level. So this is increasing in this direction. The black ones are with UVB exposure and the gray ones are without. Okay, and what is the relationship between UVB exposure and altitude as established by the researchers? That at higher altitudes, you have less DNA damage, right? Because of UVB exposure, because these frogs have adapted, and lower you have more DNA damage because these frogs have not adapted to UVB, and so UVB exposure causes more DNA damage to frogs that live at lower altitudes. Okay, so we have to find a data point that's inconsistent with this. Option A, the population of 800 meters above sea level without UVB exposure experienced less DNA damage than in the population at 450 meters without UVB exposure. So 800 meters without UVB experienced less damage than 450 meters without UVB. Okay, so without UVB is not a problem. That can absolutely happen. We are interested in UVB exposure, so it's not A. The population at 410 meters without UVB exposure experienced less damage than did the population at 410 meters with UVB exposure. So we are looking at the same altitude without UVB and with UVB. Yeah, so again, this comparison is fine because obviously we are not talking about the same altitude, right? When we are looking at data, we're looking at different altitudes. So B is fine. The population at 800 meters above sea level with UVB exposure, okay, so this data experienced more DNA damage than did the population at 294 meters with UVB exposure. Right, so this is not consistent, right? Because if you have a higher altitude, then UVB exposure should cause less DNA damage, right? Compared to this, so this should be my answer. The population at 450 meters above sea level with UVB exposure experienced more DNA damage than did the population at 2450 meters above sea level with UVB exposure. Yeah, so this is consistent because higher altitudes, less DNA damage owing to UVB exposure. So this data point is fine. So that's not my answer. The answer would be C. C is inconsistent. Okay. Let's grade this starting from 22. B, C, D, B, A, B, C, D, BA, 27 ADCACC. ADCACC. Okay, great. So we got all correct. Hope this exercise helped. If it did, hit like and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comment section what other videos you'd like me to upload. I'll see you guys in a new video soon. Take care. Bye-bye.